An ordinary park ranger heard muffled cries coming from inside a rock. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but when he took a sledgehammer and broke the stone, what appeared inside left everyone speechless. Subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching this video from. The morning began like any other in Silver Creek National Park. A thin mist clung to the ridges, rising from the soaked earth after a night of relentless rain. The storm had passed only hours before, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet pine and iron-rich stone. The sky above the Arkansas hills had cleared into a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that carried both calm and melancholy. Marcus Brown, as he did every morning, parked his old forest green Jeep near the ranger outpost and stepped out into the silence of the recovering forest. He stretched his back, still stiff from the drive, and listened. There was no sound of traffic, no hum of voices, only the steady dripping of water from the canopy and the distant murmur of a swollen creek. It was the kind of silence he trusted, one that always seemed to hold its breath before the day began. Marcus had been a park guide for almost 10 years. Before that, he'd served 12 years in the Marines, stationed overseas in places he preferred not to talk about. He was a man of quiet habits and disciplined routines, the kind that gave his life structure after too much chaos. His mornings were sacred. A thermos of black coffee, a quick check of the day's schedule, and an early patrol along one of the longer routes before tourists began to appear. It was his way of making peace with the land. Over time, he had come to know every inch of this park, the creeks that changed color after rain, the hollow trees that smelled of rot, the cliff edges that looked harmless until you got too close. Silver Creek had become his refuge, the only place where he could hear his own thoughts without the noise of memory intruding. That morning, though, something about the landscape felt altered. Perhaps it was the storm. The park always changed after heavy rain. The riverbeds deepened, the trails vanished under mudslides, and the cliffs sometimes gave way, exposing veins of ancient stone that had been hidden for centuries. Marcus noticed one such change near the edge of the old trail, a section closed to visitors due to erosion. He paused, scanning the slope with trained eyes. The soil had shifted. Part of the limestone face had crumbled, leaving a narrow fissure that hadn't been there before. It stretched vertically, a dark wound against the pale rock. He stepped closer, boots squelching in the damp clay, and crouched to examine it. The fissure was about the width of his forearm, irregular but deep, as if the earth itself had been split open by invisible hands. He leaned forward, feeling a faint draft of cool air escaping from inside. It carried the sharp mineral scent of underground water mixed with something mustier, older. Marcus made a note of the location in his worn leather field book, as he always did when spotting changes along the terrain. But as he turned to leave, something caught his attention. A low sound, distant yet strangely distinct. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks through the hollows of the cliff. But the longer he stood still, the more certain he became that the sound was not the voice of air. It was human, faint but unmistakable, rising and falling like a groan trapped in stone. Marcus froze. He had heard many things in these hills, coyotes crying at dusk, owls calling from unseen perches, but this was different. It had rhythm, depth, a kind of desperation that pricked the skin on the back of his neck. He stepped closer again, pressing his ear to the rock. The sound came once more, a faint moan, followed by silence. For a long moment, he stayed like that, his breath shallow, his palm resting on the cold surface. It was absurd to think anyone could be inside the mountain. The fissure wasn't wide enough for even a small animal to squeeze through. He tried to reason with himself. It could be a trick of acoustics, perhaps water echoing through underground channels. The park was full of caves, some known, many undocumented. Yet, even as he told himself that, something in his gut refused to let it go. The tone of that sound had been unmistakably human. Marcus stepped back, eyes scanning the slope. The earth was unstable. Large slabs of rock had broken loose and lay scattered near the base, some as heavy as a car. Maybe, he thought, someone had been hiking before the storm and got caught in a rockfall. Tourists ignored warning signs all the time. He crouched again and called out, his voice echoing sharply. "Hello? Anyone there?" Only the whisper of wind answered. The silence returned thicker than before, pressing against his ears. He waited another minute, then shook his head. It was probably nothing. His mind must have been overreacting. He'd spent too long alone in these woods, listening to every strange echo the land produced. Still, as he turned away, the faint sound came again. 3 short, uneven moans, like someone exhaling through clenched teeth. He spun around, heart suddenly pounding. This time, he was sure. Someone was behind that rock. Instinct replaced doubt. He rushed to the jeep for his flashlight and small climbing hammer, tools he always carried for emergencies. Back at the fissure, he wedged the light into the crevice. The beam illuminated dust and bits of fallen grit, revealing nothing but rough stone. He tapped the side of the rock with his hammer. The echo returned hollow, not solid like the surrounding wall. There was space behind it, a cavity of some kind. Marcus felt a chill rise along his spine. He considered calling for help, but the park's radio signal often failed in this part of the mountains. The nearest ranger station was several miles away, and the trail was muddy from the rain. He decided to mark the spot and return later with proper equipment. But, as he scribbled coordinates into his notebook, a faint whisper floated out from the crack, so weak it might have been imagined. A single word, stretched and trembling. "Help." Marcus's hand went cold. The hammer slipped from his fingers and clattered against the rock. He stared at the fissure, unable to move. The logical part of his brain fought to explain it. Sound reflections, auditory illusions, fatigue. But no argument could wash away the raw, instinctive certainty that someone alive was trapped inside. He tried shouting again, his voice louder this time, commanding, "Hey, can you hear me?" Nothing. Then another whisper, more like a sigh. He pressed his palm to the stone and thought he felt a faint vibration beneath it, the pulse of a weak struggle. A wave of nausea hit him. He stepped back, realizing his heart was hammering against his ribs. He forced himself to breathe slowly, counting like he used to during combat drills. 1, 2, 3, hold, release. The clouds above were beginning to thin, and sunlight poured across the slope in broken rays, touching the edges of the fissure with a dull, golden sheen. Marcus crouched again, staring into the crack. The light from his flashlight flickered over the damp walls inside, revealing tiny scratches, hundreds of them, some fresh, some old, overlapping like claw marks. He reached inside, running his fingertips across the grooves. They were deep, deliberate. Someone had tried to dig their way out. He withdrew his hand, heart heavy. Whoever it was, if they were even still alive, couldn't have survived long without food or air. And yet, the voice he'd heard hadn't sounded like a ghostly echo or mere coincidence. It had been immediate, desperate, human. The wind picked up again, whistling through the ravine. For a moment, it carried the same tone as the earlier sound, as if mocking his confusion. Marcus turned off the flashlight, slid it into his vest pocket, and looked out at the horizon. The park stretched endlessly before him, rivers, cliffs, meadows shimmering with morning light. To anyone else, it would have seemed untouched, pure, eternal. But to him, it suddenly looked haunted, not by spirits but by the unknown things that hid in its silence. He stood there for several minutes trying to decide what to do. Training told him to report the anomaly to the ranger headquarters to let the proper authorities handle it. But something deeper, a quiet moral instinct he had carried since the Marines, told him he couldn't just leave. He had seen too many cases where hesitation had cost lives. Even a few hours could make the difference between saving someone and finding a body. Yet reason whispered back. He had no evidence, no witness, only a strange sound after a storm. If he called in a false alarm, he'd be the subject of ridicule for weeks. And still, that faint whisper echoed in his mind, over and over. Help. Finally, Marcus pulled a small red flag from his backpack and drove it into the ground near the fissure to mark the spot. He took several photos from different angles, making sure the coordinates on his GPS matched his notes. Then, reluctantly, he began the hike back to the Jeep. His boots sank into the mud, each step heavier than the last. He told himself he'd return tomorrow with better tools, maybe a drill, maybe even a small team from maintenance. For now, it was safer to wait. Halfway down the trail, he stopped again. The forest was utterly still. Not even the birds were singing. He turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Behind him, the fissure was barely visible now, just a dark scar in the pale wall of stone. He strained his ears. Nothing. Then, as he turned away once more, a faint echo drifted across the wind. Soft, fleeting, but unmistakable. It wasn't a word this time, only a fragile sound, the exhale of someone too weak to call out again. Marcus stood rooted in place, a single drop of sweat tracing down his temple. The rational world felt as if it had tilted beneath him, leaving him suspended between reason and instinct. He didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't believe in omens, but he did believe in one simple truth, that sometimes what you hear once is enough to change everything. As he climbed back into the Jeep and drove toward the outpost, the mountains loomed behind him, their shadows stretching long across the valley. The fissure was hidden again, silent and still. Yet, in the hum of the engine, beneath the rhythm of tires against the muddy path, Marcus could swear he heard it again, softer now, as if carried by memory itself. Help me. He gripped the steering wheel tighter and stared straight ahead. Tomorrow, he promised himself. Tomorrow, he would return. He didn't yet know that the sound behind the rock would not only lead him to another man's suffering, but also unravel the quiet order of his own life. For the first time in years, the mountains no longer felt safe. They felt alive, listening, waiting for him to come back. The night after Marcus discovered the fissure refused to pass quietly. The sound of rain tapping against the roof of his cabin should have soothed him, but instead it only deepened the unease that had taken hold of his mind. He sat by the small kitchen table, a mug of coffee growing cold in front of him, staring at the notebook where he had written the coordinates of the rock. The lines of his handwriting seemed to waver in the dim yellow light. Every time he read the words, possible voice, human, trapped, a chill went through him. He had written such notes before, but never something like this. Never a claim that suggested a person might still be alive inside stone. The logical part of him tried to dismiss the thought. He told himself that what he'd heard must have been the echo of dripping water or air moving through underground cavities. Limestone formations were full of strange acoustic tricks. Still, no amount of reasoning made that whisper fade from his memory. It had been too clear, too human. The timbre of it, the breath between syllables, the tremor that carried through the rock, was not something a current of wind could create. He rose from the table and went to the window. The park lay in darkness beyond the rain-streaked glass, a dense wall of trees swaying under the wind. Somewhere out there, behind that curtain of forest, was the fissure. He imagined it as he had left it, the red flag he'd planted swaying faintly in the wet soil, the black mouth of the crack waiting in silence. It felt wrong to be sitting here in warmth and light while that sound still echoed inside the mountain. But what was he supposed to do? He wasn't a rescuer anymore. He was a guide, a caretaker of trails, not someone trained for cave extractions or geological hazards. And yet, if he did nothing and there truly was someone alive in there, what kind of man would that make him? His radio lay on the counter, silent. Marcus turned it on, adjusted the frequency, and tried to reach the main ranger station. Static answered him. The storm had knocked out most of the network. He switched it off again and sighed. There would be no help until morning. The park would open late tomorrow because of debris on the roads, which gave him time to go back before anyone else arrived. He wasn't sure what he would do when he got there. Perhaps take better photos, maybe clear some of the loose stone, or simply listen again to confirm what he'd heard. He tried to sleep after midnight, but the darkness inside his cabin felt restless. Each creak of the wood, each distant rustle of wind through branches, took the shape of that whisper in his mind. He dreamed of water seeping between rocks, of hands clawing from beneath the earth, of a breath that never stopped calling. When he woke before dawn, his bed sheets were damp with sweat and his pulse still raced as though he had been running. By sunrise, Marcus had already packed his gear: a flashlight, a crowbar, gloves, and a camera. He stuffed everything into his backpack, locked the cabin door, and started the Jeep. The road was slick, a winding ribbon of mud that glistened under the weak morning light. The air smelled of ozone and pine sap, sharp and clean, as though the storm had washed away every trace of the world but left behind something raw. The tires slipped once or twice on the incline, but he knew these roads like the lines of his own palm. When he reached the point where the dirt path met the trailhead, he parked, stepped out, and felt the ground give slightly under his boots. The rain had softened the soil, and the forest was eerily quiet. The only sound was the distant croak of a raven echoing through the mist. He started the hike up toward the fissure, his breath steady, his mind focused. Each step was measured, deliberate, but beneath that calm rhythm pulsed a growing dread he couldn't name. The old trail wound upward between moss-covered boulders and gnarled roots. Half an hour into the climb, Marcus stopped to rest, setting down his pack on a patch of damp grass. His eyes scanned the tree line automatically. Something about the forest felt different this morning, too still, as if every creature had fled. He crouched and touched the soil near his boots. It was cold, unnaturally so, and wet with a film of water that shimmered faintly, reflecting the pale gray light. When he finally reached the ridge where the fissure was, the red flag he had left yesterday was still there, though bent by the rain. The crack itself looked narrower in daylight, less ominous, almost insignificant against the vast wall of rock. He stood before it for several minutes, expecting perhaps that the voice would return immediately. But there was nothing. only the soft hiss of wind and the faint trickle of water dripping down the stone. He felt foolish. Marcus crouched beside the fissure, shining his flashlight inside. Dust motes floated in the beam, swirling slowly, and the smell of damp stone filled his nose. He spoke quietly, feeling absurd for doing so. "Hello? Anyone there?" The words bounced back to him, hollow and flat. He waited, holding his breath. No response came. For the first time, he began to question his own memory. Could he really have imagined it? The exhaustion of long hours, the isolation. He'd seen other rangers crack under less. To test his sanity, Marcus decided to record. He pulled his phone from his pocket, set it to video mode, and leaned it against a nearby stone, facing the fissure. Then he took the crowbar and began to tap along the rock, listening for hollow sections. A dull thud echoed back, then another. But near the center, the sound changed, sharper, emptier, like striking a drum. He crouched lower, pressing his ear against the cold surface. For several seconds there was nothing. Then, faintly, unmistakably, came a sound from deep within. A soft rhythm, irregular but deliberate, like the tapping of fingers or knuckles on stone. Marcus's blood ran cold. He froze, afraid to move, afraid even to breathe. The tapping came again, weaker now, and then stopped. He pulled away, staring at the rock as though it might move. His mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe an animal trapped in a cavity, a raccoon, a bird caught in a crevice. But animals didn't make rhythmic, human-like patterns. His heart hammered in his chest. He picked up the phone and replayed the recording. Through the background hiss of the wind, he heard it again. The faint taps, 3 short beats, followed by 2 slower ones. They weren't random. They were a signal. Someone was alive in there. For a moment, his knees weakened. The enormity of it struck him. 3 years ago, a local man named Joseph Miller had disappeared in this same region. Marcus remembered the flyers that had hung on every post for months. The preacher, in his 40s, last seen driving toward Silver Creek for an evening hike. Search teams had combed the park for weeks and found nothing. Some said he'd fallen into one of the caves. Others whispered darker theories. Marcus had guided several of those search parties himself, walking these very trails. Could it be possible that this was him? Could a man have survived somehow, trapped beneath the earth for years? The thought was insane, and yet the tapping he'd heard was real. Marcus knew he had to act fast, but even as he considered it, fear wrapped its hands around his chest. The rock was unstable. If he tried to pry it open alone, the whole face could collapse. And if he left now to call for help, it might take hours for anyone to arrive, assuming he could even reach them. Whoever was inside might not have hours. He knelt beside the fissure again and shouted louder, "Hold on, I hear you, I'll get help." The echo of his voice seemed to fill the canyon, but he couldn't tell if it reached the one who was trapped. There was no response this time. The silence that followed felt thicker, heavier than before. As he packed his tools, preparing to head back to the jeep, he caught sight of something on the ground near the base of the fissure. A piece of cloth, faded, half buried in mud. He pulled it free and examined it. It was part of a sleeve, the fabric coarse and weathered, but clearly human-made. His pulse quickened. Someone had been here. Maybe recently, maybe long ago. Either way, it confirmed what he already suspected. This wasn't just some geological trick. There was a person involved. The descent down the trail felt endless. The forest seemed to close in around him, branches whispering faintly overhead. He replayed the recording again and again as he walked, each time trying to convince himself that what he heard could be explained away. But every playback only made the pattern clearer. It was not random. It was deliberate. Back at the Jeep, Marcus tried the radio once more. Static. He slammed his fist against the dashboard in frustration. The nearest working signal might be at the outpost 10 miles away. It would take him almost an hour on the muddy roads. Still, he had no choice. He started the engine and drove, the tires spinning through puddles. The wind roared against the windshield, carrying the scent of rain-soaked leaves. Halfway to the outpost, as the road curved along a ravine, Marcus slowed. The world outside the glass looked distorted, shimmering with fog. He thought of the stories local rangers sometimes told, about strange sounds heard after storms, about hikers vanishing without trace. He'd always dismissed them as campfire talk, but now they gnawed at the edges of his reason. Was it possible that what he'd found was something more than an accident? He forced himself to push the thought aside. No myths, no superstitions. There was a rational explanation. There had to be. When he finally reached the outpost, the main communications line was still down, but he managed to find a working satellite phone. He called emergency services, his voice steady despite the anxiety tightening his throat. He gave coordinates, described the fissure, explained what he'd heard. The dispatcher on the other end sounded skeptical, but promised to send a team to investigate. They told him to stay put. Marcus refused. He was going back. By the time he returned to the trail, the sun was beginning to sink behind the mountains, painting the cliffs in copper and shadow. He parked the Jeep, grabbed his gear, and hurried up the slope again. The light faded quickly as he climbed, the air turning colder, the forest falling silent once more. When he reached the fissure, he could barely see the red flag in the dimness. He set his flashlight down and pressed his ear against the rock one more time. Nothing. No tapping, no voice, only the distant drip of water echoing deep inside. For the first time that day, Marcus felt the full weight of doubt settle on him. Maybe whoever had been there was gone now. Maybe he had been too late. He sat down heavily on a nearby stone, exhaustion catching up with him. The mountains around him were dark silhouettes against the dying light. And then, just as he was about to stand, there came a sound, so faint that he thought it might be his imagination. A single, trembling breath from within the rock. It was weak, but alive. He closed his eyes, gripping the edge of the fissure. "Hold on," he whispered. "I'm here." The wind swept through the valley again, carrying the scent of pine and cold stone. Marcus sat there until darkness swallowed the last trace of light, the weight of the mountains pressing down on his thoughts. He didn't yet know how deep the truth beneath that rock went, but he understood one thing beyond all doubt. He couldn't walk away now. Something in him had already crossed the line between curiosity and duty, between reason and fear. When he finally rose to leave, he glanced one last time at the fissure. The light from his flashlight flickered across its jagged surface, revealing the scratches once more. Fresh ones now, etched into the stone as if by desperate hands. The realization hit him like ice. Someone inside had been trying to reach him again, only moments before he arrived. As he turned toward the trail, the forest around him exhaled. The night had come fully alive, whispering through the trees. Marcus walked on, each step carrying him deeper into a mystery that reason could no longer contain. Tomorrow, he promised himself, he would not come back alone. tomorrow he would bring help. But deep down, he already feared that whatever waited inside that rock had been waiting for far longer than anyone could understand. The night after the second visit left Marcus drained to the bone. He had not slept properly in 2 days, and yet his mind refused to rest. Each time he closed his eyes, the image of that fissure reappeared in his thoughts, the jagged slit in the rock, the faint sound of tapping, the final shallow breath he had heard before leaving. It came to him in the dark, like an echo that had learned his name. He lay in bed until dawn, waiting for light to wash the images away. But even morning brought no clarity. The rising sun only seemed to make the world look harsher, more fragile. At 7, he returned to the ranger station to check if the rescue team had made contact. They had not. Communications were still unstable, and the dispatcher could not confirm whether the report had even been received by the main district office. Marcus felt the weight of that silence pressing on him like the mountain itself. He was supposed to wait for assistance, yet every instinct in him screamed to go back. The rational side of him, trained by years of discipline and protocol, tried to resist. But reason had begun to feel thin and brittle, like the shell of something breaking from within. He brewed himself another pot of coffee, its bitterness a small comfort, and stared at the map of Silver Creek spread across his desk. The red marker he had drawn around the fissure burned like a wound on paper. He told himself he would only take another look, nothing reckless, just one more inspection until the professionals arrived. But deep down, he knew he would not be able to stop once he returned there. There was something about that place, about that quiet plea for help, that had already tied itself to him. It wasn't duty anymore. It was something personal. By mid-morning, he packed his tools again. Gloves, flashlight, crowbar, a small chisel, rope, and water. The sky was clear this time, the air still damp from the storm. Birds had returned to the canopy, chirping softly, unaware of the human unease moving through the forest below. The trail to the fissure seemed longer today, every step accompanied by the creak of leather and the soft scrape of gravel underfoot. Marcus felt the muscles in his shoulders tighten, but it wasn't just from exertion. He carried the sensation of being watched, not by eyes, but by the weight of the mountain itself. When he reached the ridge, the red flag was gone. Only the wooden stake remained, snapped clean in half. The fissure, however, was unchanged, dark, silent, waiting. He knelt down and examined the ground. The prints of his boots from the previous day were still faintly visible, but there were new marks beside them, scattered impressions, shallow and uneven, as though someone barefoot had walked there after him. He frowned and brushed away the mud with his glove. The prints led straight to the rock and disappeared into the narrow opening. For a moment, he wondered if it was his imagination, if the erosion of rain had simply distorted the shapes, but they were too defined for coincidence. He set down his pack and began to clear the debris around the fissure. The work was slow. The stones were heavy, fused together with hardened clay and roots. He pried them loose one at a time, stacking them to the side. Each sound of shifting rock sent small avalanches of pebbles rolling down the slope. After nearly an hour of labor, the opening widened just enough for him to angle the flashlight deeper inside. The beam illuminated a hollow chamber no bigger than a small car, its walls slick with condensation. Near the far end, the light reflected off something pale and unmoving. Marcus leaned closer, straining to see. It was not a trick of the light. It was a hand. He froze, feeling the pulse in his throat quicken. The hand was small, thin, curled slightly inward as if resting or waiting. The skin was grayish, coated with a layer of dust and mineral residue. For a moment, he thought he was looking at a corpse. But then, against all reason, the fingers twitched. Just once, faintly, but enough to erase every doubt. The man inside was alive. "Jesus," Marcus whispered under his breath, though his voice sounded foreign to him. He dropped to his knees and examined the opening again. It was too narrow to pull anyone through. He would have to break more rock. But doing so alone risked collapse. The air inside the hollow already felt stale when he leaned near it. Too much vibration might bring down the ceiling. Yet, leaving now felt impossible. The thought of walking away while someone still breathed inside that stone filled him with a shame so sharp it cut through fear. He steadied his breath, removed his gloves, and reached into the fissure as far as his arm would allow. The hand inside was cold to the touch, but not lifeless. The skin was dry, cracked. He gripped it gently. There was no strength in the fingers, but after a long pause they responded with the faintest pressure, an acknowledgement, a plea. "I've got you," he muttered instinctively, though the man inside likely could not hear him. Marcus pulled his hand back and began to work with renewed urgency. He switched tools, using the chisel to chip away the thinnest sections of stone. Every strike echoed painfully loud, each vibration a reminder that one wrong hit could bury them both. Sweat rolled down his face, mixing with dust. His arms ached, but he refused to stop. He widened the fissure by inches, creating a narrow passage big enough to slide a shoulder through. Finally, when his flashlight beam reached farther into the hollow, he could see the rest of the trapped man. He was sitting upright, his back braced against the stone, his knees drawn close to his chest. His hair was long, tangled, streaked with white. The remains of what might once have been a shirt clung to his frame in shreds. His eyes were closed, his lips dry and cracked. Marcus leaned in closer, calling softly. "Hey, can you hear me?" At first, there was no answer. Then, a shallow breath. The man's head tilted slightly, as though the sound of Marcus's voice came to him from a great distance. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing a pair of dull blue eyes that struggled to focus. Marcus felt a wave of disbelief. Whoever this man was, he had been here for a very long time. "I'm going to get you out," Marcus said, his voice trembling despite his effort to stay calm. The man's lips moved, forming words Marcus could not hear. He leaned closer, and the whisper came, barely audible, a rasp of air. "Light. Too bright." Marcus instinctively turned the flashlight away, leaving only a soft reflection from the wall. The man's breathing steadied, though each inhale was shallow, strained. It was clear he couldn't survive much longer in there. Marcus needed help, and fast, but if he left now to fetch a team, there was no telling whether the man would still be alive by the time they returned. He had to at least open the passage wide enough for air to flow freely. He resumed chiseling, slower now, careful to avoid loose rock. Time seemed to dissolve into repetition. The rhythmic strike, the crunch of stone, the distant sound of his own breath. After what felt like hours, the opening was finally large enough for him to reach both arms inside. He gripped the man under his arms and tried to lift. The body was shockingly light, bones under thin layers of skin. But the narrowness of the gap made movement difficult. Marcus repositioned himself, using his shoulder for leverage. With a final heave, he managed to shift the man forward by a few inches. The air inside the cavity stirred, releasing a musty, ancient odor of damp minerals and human decay. "Hold on," Marcus gasped, more to himself than to the man. He worked his fingers beneath the man's arms again, pulling until finally the shoulders cleared the edge of the fissure. The man let out a hoarse cry, a sound that might have been pain or relief, and then collapsed against Marcus's chest. They both fell backward onto the ground, Marcus clutching the limp figure as if afraid he might vanish if released. For a long while, neither of them moved. The forest around them was silent except for Marcus's ragged breathing. When he finally dared to look down, the man's eyes were open again, glassy but aware. He was alive, impossibly alive. Marcus laid him gently on the ground, propping his head on his folded jacket. He unscrewed his canteen and held it to the man's lips. The first few drops spilled over, but then he began to swallow weakly, each gulp sounding like sandpaper scraping against wood. After a few moments, he turned his face away, exhausted. Marcus didn't push. The man needed air, rest, warmth, all things that stone had denied him. It took nearly 10 minutes for the man to whisper again. "How long?" he rasped. Marcus hesitated. "I don't know," he said softly, "but you're safe now. You're out." The man's eyes filled with tears that did not fall. He closed them again, murmuring something Marcus could not understand. His voice carried the strange rhythm of prayer or confession. Marcus listened, unsure whether to feel comforted or haunted by it. He checked the man's pulse. It was faint but steady. Relief washed through him. He looked back at the fissure, now gaping open like the mouth of a secret finally forced to speak. Inside, the hollow shimmered with moisture, and beyond that, darkness stretched deeper than his light could reach. He wondered if others had been trapped before, if there were more chambers hidden beneath the mountain, filled with silence and unanswered cries. When he finally called for help through the portable radio, the signal crackled faintly, but this time someone answered. A search and rescue team was already en route, though they warned it could take hours to reach his location. Marcus agreed to wait. He had no intention of leaving now. He sat beside the man as the afternoon waned, occasionally giving him sips of water. Each time the wind shifted, it carried the scent of the earth newly opened, like a grave disturbed after too many years. The man drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes whispering fragments, names, verses, and phrases that made little sense. Marcus caught one sentence clearly before the man fell silent again. "They said the stone would listen." By the time the rescue team arrived, the sun was dipping low, turning the sky into streaks of amber and violet. The medics rushed forward, checking vitals, covering the man with blankets, preparing to carry him down. Marcus stood aside, his hands trembling, his clothes covered in dust and streaks of dried blood. One of the rescuers looked at him and said quietly, "You did good, man. You saved his life." But Marcus didn't feel like a savior. He felt like someone who had trespassed into a secret he was not meant to uncover. He watched as they lifted the man onto a stretcher, his thin arm dangling loosely from beneath the blanket. The fingers twitched once more, as if in farewell, before the medics carried him away. When they disappeared down the trail, Marcus turned back to the fissure one last time. The opening was silent now, but he could not shake the feeling that it still breathed faintly, exhaling the memory of the man it had held for so long. The scratches inside the stone seemed to shimmer in the fading light, lines of human desperation etched into eternity. He stood there until the forest darkened around him, unwilling to move. The mountains no longer looked timeless or serene. They looked alive, ancient, and watchful. Somewhere, deep within that rock, he imagined the echo of that first whisper repeating endlessly, "Help, help, help," until someone else came to listen. And though the voice had found its way out, Marcus knew that the sound of it would never stop following him. Marcus did not remember much about the descent from the ridge that day. The forest seemed to blur around him, a wash of movement and color broken only by the sound of boots against wet soil and the echo of stretcher wheels grinding over uneven ground. The medics moved quickly but carefully, keeping the rescued man stable as they guided him down the slope. Marcus followed a few paces behind, numb, his mind trapped somewhere between disbelief and exhaustion. Every few minutes he looked back toward the fissure, expecting it to vanish into the mountain, as if none of it had ever happened. But it remained, a dark wound in the rock, silently watching him go. When they finally reached the base of the trail, a rescue truck was waiting with its lights flashing faintly in the fading daylight. The paramedics transferred the man inside, attaching tubes and checking his pulse. Marcus caught a glimpse of the figure through the open doors, a frail shape wrapped in gray blankets, his face almost colorless under the harsh fluorescent light. The man's eyes opened for a moment and met Marcus's. There was no recognition, no understanding, only the hollow gaze of someone who had spent too long between life and death. Then the doors closed, and the truck drove off toward the nearest hospital. The forest fell silent again. Marcus stood beside his jeep, mud up to his calves, his hands trembling. The rescuers offered to drive him back, but he refused. He needed the drive alone, needed time to let the reality of what had just happened sink in. He climbed into the jeep, turned the key, and let the engine's low growl break the quiet. The headlights cut through the mist as he started the long, winding road back toward the ranger outpost. The mountains had begun to swallow the last traces of light. Shadows stretched long across the trail, and the air turned colder with every mile. He tried to steady his thoughts, but they ran wild. How long had that man been in there? Days? Weeks? Years? The state of his body said it had been longer than anyone could believe. No human should have survived that kind of isolation, buried alive beneath layers of stone. And yet, Marcus had felt the pulse beneath his fingers, faint but real. He had heard the man breathe. He reached the outpost after nightfall. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered weakly, casting a sickly hue on the wooden walls. He washed his hands in cold water until the dirt and blood were gone, then leaned over the sink, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at him seemed older than he remembered, eyes sunken, stubble graying around the chin, jaw tight with something between fear and awe. He had saved a life today, they told him, but the word saved felt too simple, too small for what he had seen. It was as if the mountains themselves had decided to release their secret, and he had merely been the one standing close enough to witness it. Later that night, he wrote a report for the Park Service, describing every detail in clinical, detached language. Coordinates, geological structure, depth of fissure, the condition of the rescued man, estimated time of discovery. Yet each sentence felt hollow, mechanical, stripped of the strangeness that still vibrated under his skin. He could not bring himself to write about the whispers, the hand reaching out through the stone, or the way the man had seemed to know life before seeing it. No one would believe that. No one should. Sleep refused to come. Around midnight, Marcus left the outpost and stepped outside. The air was sharp, the forest black and silent. Above, the stars burned with a cold, steady light. Somewhere far beyond the trees, he could hear the faint rumble of a distant river. He thought about the man in the hospital, lying beneath sterile lights, surrounded by machines instead of mountains. Would he survive the night? Would he even remember what had happened? The following morning brought news from the hospital. The man was alive but weak, severely dehydrated and malnourished. His name was confirmed: Joseph Miller. The same preacher who had vanished 3 years earlier after telling friends he was going on a spiritual retreat in the wilderness. The discovery spread through the small community like wildfire. Newspapers called it a miracle. Television crews set up near the park entrance. People flocked to the ranger station demanding interviews, details, explanations. Marcus tried to avoid them all. He hadn't saved Joseph Miller for fame. He hadn't even saved him intentionally. He had simply listened when others would have walked away. By noon, he was summoned to the local police office for questioning. 2 detectives met him in a small, dimly lit room with the smell of stale coffee and dust. They asked about the fissure, about the exact position of Miller's body, about whether Marcus had seen anyone else in the area. He answered carefully, his words measured. No, there was no one else. No, he didn't know how Miller had ended up there. No, he hadn't recognized him until later. The detectives exchanged glances. They wanted logic where there was none. When the questions ended, Marcus stepped outside into the blinding sunlight. The world seemed louder now. Cars honking, people shouting, news reporters holding microphones near the hospital gates. Everything felt too alive, too chaotic. The quiet of the mountains felt impossibly far away. He thought about going home, but instead he drove to the hospital. Something inside him refused to rest until he saw Miller again, breathing, alive, no longer a ghost trapped behind stone. At the reception desk, the nurse recognized him immediately. "You're the ranger, right? The one who found him?" she asked. He nodded. "He's in recovery, room 12. But don't expect much conversation. The doctors said he's barely speaking." Marcus thanked her and walked down the corridor. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled his nostrils. The rhythmic beeping of heart monitors echoed from behind the closed doors. When he entered room 12, the world seemed to slow. Miller lay in bed, propped against white pillows, his skin still pale but no longer deathly gray. His eyes were open, staring at the window where sunlight filtered through the blinds. For a moment, Marcus hesitated, unsure what to say. Then Miller turned his head slightly. Recognition flickered in his eyes, faint but real. "You, the man from the mountain?" he whispered. His voice was hoarse, his throat dry, but the words carried clarity. Marcus stepped closer. "You remember?" Miller nodded weakly. "The light. It was you. I thought it was a dream." Marcus sat down beside the bed. "You were buried under rock," he said quietly. "We thought you were dead." Miller's gaze drifted toward the ceiling. "I was dead," he murmured. "Or close enough. They left me there." The words sent a shiver through Marcus. "Who left you?" he asked. But Miller only closed his eyes, breathing shallowly, as if retreating from the memory. After a pause, he whispered again. "Men and women in gray robes. They said the earth would keep me, said the stone would hold me until I understood." Marcus felt a weight settle in his chest. What did they want? "Silence," Miller said. His eyelids fluttered open again, and for a moment his eyes seemed to clear, focusing on Marcus with startling intensity. They believed the world was poisoned by noise. Words, machines, thoughts, everything loud. They said the only way to cleanse the soul was to be still, to listen to the earth, to become part of it. Marcus didn't speak. The air in the room grew colder, though the sun still shone through the blinds. Miller turned his head slightly, his voice weakening again. "They fed me once. Tea, food. I woke in darkness. Couldn't move. I thought it was a test, But the days never ended. The silence became something else. A wall. He coughed, and Marcus poured water into a cup, helping him drink. When Miller spoke again, his voice was almost gone. I started praying. I prayed so much that words stopped meaning anything. And one day, I heard the stone breathe. I thought it was God. His eyes flicked toward Marcus. But it was you. Marcus sat motionless, unable to respond. His throat was dry. The idea that this man had been buried alive for years, convinced he was speaking to the divine, sent a chill through him, deeper than the mountain air ever had. He wanted to ask more. Who these people were, where they had gone, whether others had been taken. But Miller was already drifting back into exhaustion, his breathing slowing. The doctor entered soon after and gently ushered Marcus out. "He needs rest," she said. "He suffered from severe trauma and deprivation. It's a miracle he's alive at all." Marcus nodded and left the room, though his thoughts stayed behind. He lingered in the hallway, staring through the small glass window in the door. Miller looked peaceful now, but his words echoed relentlessly in Marcus's head. They said the stone would hold me until I understood. That evening, the town buzzed with speculation. Some called it a miracle of endurance. Others whispered about cults, kidnappings, secret rituals. Marcus avoided the reporters, locking himself in his cabin near the forest. But peace refused to follow him home. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Miller's face pale in the dim light of the fissure, the trembling hand reaching out of the stone, the desperate whisper that had pierced the quiet air. By midnight, he could not bear it any longer. He took his flashlight and stepped outside, walking toward the trailhead where the fissure lay. The forest was dark but calm, the air filled with the faint scent of pine and damp soil. The moon hung low above the mountains, its light soft and ghostly. When he reached the ridge, the opening in the rock was still there, though smaller now, partly collapsed after the rescue operation. He stood before it, letting the cool air from inside brush against his face. The silence that had once felt oppressive now seemed heavy with memory. He imagined the years Miller had spent here, trapped in darkness, his prayers echoing back from the stone until he believed they were divine replies. Marcus knelt, touching the rough surface of the wall. It was damp, cold, but no longer frightening. "You're free now," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Miller, to the mountain, or to himself. The wind shifted, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed to sigh in response. He stayed there until dawn, sitting by the fissure as the first light crept over the hills. When he finally rose to leave, he felt both heavier and strangely unburdened. The man from the stone had been saved, but part of the mountain had entered Marcus that day. It would stay with him, a reminder of how thin the veil was between silence and sound, life and death, faith and madness. As he descended the trail, he knew that this was far from over. Miller's story had only begun to unravel, and with it, the quiet world Marcus had built for himself was starting to crack, just like the rock that had hidden another man's breath for 3 long years. The following week unfolded like a dream Marcus could not fully wake from. The days at the ranger station blurred together, filled with questions from reporters, visits from investigators, and the endless echo of his own thoughts. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same questions. How had Joseph Miller survived, and who had put him there? No one had answers. The man himself, though conscious and slowly recovering, spoke little. Each word seemed to cost him more strength than his body could afford to lose. The doctors said he was stable, but fragile, his system weak from years of deprivation. Marcus visited him every evening after work, unable to stay away, drawn by a sense of unfinished duty and a curiosity that felt almost like guilt. When he entered the hospital room that first evening after the rescue, Joseph was awake but staring out the window, his face pale against the pillow. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and damp linens. Marcus hesitated by the door until the old man turned his head. For a moment, their eyes met, and Joseph's lips curled into a faint shadow of a smile. "You came back," he said softly. His voice had the dry rasp of someone unused to speech. "I wasn't sure you were real." "I'm real," Marcus said. He pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down. "You've been through hell, Joseph. Everyone thought you were dead." Joseph blinked slowly. "I thought I was too," he whispered. His hands trembled as he tried to adjust the blanket, and Marcus helped him. There was a long silence between them before Joseph spoke again. "They told me I wouldn't die. They said death would be too easy." The words sent a chill through Marcus. "Who told you that?" Joseph's eyes moved toward the window again, unfocused, as if he were seeing something far away. "The ones who took me there," he said. "The ones who believed the earth could cleanse sin." He began to talk in fragments, his voice uneven, sometimes breaking into coughs that forced Marcus to wait. The story unfolded slowly, piece by piece, like shards of glass that had to be handled carefully to avoid cutting too deep. 3 years earlier, Joseph had been a local preacher in a small church outside Silver Creek. He was known for his compassion, for spending long nights visiting the sick and poor, for walking barefoot into the hills to pray. But as time passed, he became restless. He felt that his congregation's faith had grown shallow, too dependent on comfort and routine. "We prayed with our lips," he said, "but not with our hearts. I wanted to hear the real voice of God, not just my own words echoing off the walls of a church." That was when the letters began to arrive, anonymous, written in delicate handwriting, always signed only with the words "The Keepers of Silence." They spoke of an ancient order, seekers who believed that true enlightenment could only be found through absolute stillness. They invited him to join them for a communion with the earth somewhere deep in the mountains. Joseph ignored the first few, thinking they were the work of eccentrics, but over time the letters grew more personal, quoting his own sermons, his own doubts, words he had never written down. It was as if someone knew his thoughts. "I should have burned them," he said, shaking his head. "But loneliness does strange things to faith. When they offered me the chance to listen, to truly listen, I went." Marcus listened, his hands folded tightly on his knees. He imagined the scene Joseph described, the night he drove up the winding road to meet them, the silver of the moon reflected in the windshield, the forest rising like a black wall around him. He could almost see it, the loneliness, the longing for something greater, the small spark of hope that this would finally fill the emptiness that prayer no longer reached. "They were waiting for me," Joseph continued. "Two of them, a man and a woman. Both wore gray cloaks that covered their faces. They spoke softly, kindly. They said the world was sick with noise, that every word, every machine, every heartbeat of civilization was killing the earth. I thought they were mad, but when they spoke, I felt calm, as if their words came from inside my own head." They had led him to a small cabin deep in the woods, served him a meal of rice and herbs, and poured him a cup of tea that smelled faintly of lavender and metal. He remembered the warmth spreading through his body, the way his limbs grew heavy. "I thought it was peace," he whispered. "It was poison." When he woke, he was in darkness. At first, he thought he was dreaming, still trapped between prayer and sleep. The walls were smooth stone. He could not move his legs. His hands touched rock so close that he could barely stretch his arms. There was air, but it was thin and cold. He screamed until his throat tore, but no one answered. Only silence. Marcus felt his chest tighten as he listened. He could picture it, the blackness, the suffocating press of stone, the sound of his own breath bouncing back at him. "How did you survive?" he asked quietly. Joseph smiled faintly, though his eyes glistened. "I prayed. I drank the water that dripped from the ceiling. I counted my breaths. I tried to remember the Psalms, but after a while, even the words vanished. I stopped knowing whether I was alive. Sometimes I thought I heard voices, them whispering through the rock. Sometimes I thought I heard God. And sometimes I heard nothing at all, and that was worse." He paused, taking the long, shaky breath. "After a time, I stopped fighting it. I stopped being angry. I began to listen, like they said, to the stillness, to the pulse of the mountain. And then, one day, I realized there was another rhythm. Faint, distant, but real. The sound of footsteps, maybe, or digging. I thought I had gone mad, but it kept coming. And then, finally, I heard your voice." Marcus swallowed hard. He remembered that moment, the whisper through the rock, the faint vibration against his palm. "It wasn't a miracle," he said quietly. "It was just chance." Joseph shook his head. "No, it was grace. I prayed for years for someone to hear. You did." They sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the late afternoon light dimmed into a soft gray, and the hospital lights flickered on one by one. Joseph's voice weakened as he spoke of the last days before Marcus found him. The tremors from the storm had loosened the stones around his prison, letting air and water seep in. He had felt the ground shift, the faint tremor of the mountain cracking open. "I thought it was the end," he said. "I was ready for it. But instead, there was light. Your light." When he finished, Marcus felt hollow, as if the story had drained something out of him. He tried to imagine the strength it took to survive, not just physically, but in spirit. Joseph Miller was not a ghost or a myth. He was a man who had been broken and somehow kept breathing. A nurse came to check Joseph's vitals, and Marcus stood to leave. But as he reached the door, the old man spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "Marcus," he said, and when Marcus turned, Joseph's eyes were sharper, more alive than before. "Don't let them come back." Marcus frowned. "Who?" "The keepers," Joseph murmured. "They will look for me. They'll say they want to help, but they only want silence. They can't stand that the mountain spoke back." Those words stayed with Marcus long after he left the hospital. That night, as he sat alone in his cabin, the forest outside seemed too still. Even the crickets had gone quiet. He kept replaying Joseph's voice in his head, its cracked, urgent tone, the certainty of fear behind it. He wanted to dismiss it as the paranoia of a man who had spent too long in darkness, but deep down he felt something stir, a quiet unease that refused to fade. Over the next few days, rumors began to spread. Some claimed Joseph had been a part of a cult, others that he had staged his own disappearance as a test of faith. The sheriff's department found traces of the cabin he described, though by the time they arrived it had burned to the ground. Marcus was called in again for questioning, but there was nothing more he could offer. The mountain had given up one of its secrets, but the rest remained buried. Each night he drove past the park's entrance, the outline of the cliffs barely visible in the moonlight. He thought of the fissure, now sealed by the rescue team to prevent accidents. He thought of the scratches on the stone, the hand reaching toward him. And sometimes, if the wind shifted just right, He could almost imagine hearing that faint rhythm again, the heartbeat of someone still waiting beneath the earth. On his final visit to the hospital, Joseph was sitting up, dressed in simple clothes. His hair had been cut, and his face looked cleaner, though the shadow of the mountain still lingered in his eyes. "They're discharging me soon," he said. "My family has agreed to take me north, away from here." Marcus nodded. "That's good. You need peace." Joseph smiled faintly. "Peace is never far. It's just quiet that's dangerous." They shook hands. Joseph's grip was weak but steady. As Marcus turned to leave, the old man spoke one last time. "Thank you," he said, "for listening." Driving home that evening, Marcus realized that the landscape looked different now. The same trees, the same roads, the same mountains, but beneath their stillness, he sensed something deeper, a current of life and memory that had always been there, waiting for someone to hear it. He parked his Jeep at the edge of the ridge and walked to where the fissure had once been. It was gone now, filled with concrete and stone, as if the mountain itself had chosen to forget. He stood there for a long time, watching the sun sink behind the hills. Somewhere, far below, water ran through the old channels, whispering through the cracks unseen. And in that fading light, Marcus finally understood what Joseph had meant. The silence was never empty. It was full of everything humanity had buried within it. Pain, faith, madness, hope. The mountain had not just held a man, it had held a truth too large for words. He turned away as darkness fell, the forest whispering behind him. For the first time, the sound did not frighten him. It felt like breathing. The first quiet days after Joseph's discharge felt to Marcus like a reprieve he hadn't earned. The air had turned warmer, the trees around Silver Creek flushed with the first signs of early summer, and yet something in the stillness of the park unsettled him. Tourists had begun to return, smiling families who stopped at his ranger post to ask about hiking trails and viewpoints. They spoke of waterfalls and deer sightings, oblivious to the story that had unfolded only a few miles away, to the hollow in the rock where a man had once been entombed alive. To them, the mountains were pure scenery. To Marcus, they had become something different, a living presence, watching. He couldn't look at the ridges without remembering the muffled whisper that had drawn him there. He could still feel the vibration of that sound through his palm, the weight of another man's fear trembling beneath the stone. News of the rescue had spread far beyond the county. Reporters from Little Rock, even from as far as Chicago, had come to chase the story of the preacher who survived 3 years underground. Marcus did his best to avoid them, but they were persistent. They camped outside the ranger office, their cameras always ready, asking the same questions again and again. How did you find him? Did he say who trapped him? Did you hear anything strange while digging him out? Their fascination was insatiable, and it left Marcus uneasy. The more people called it a miracle, the more it felt like a wound being reopened every day. When the official investigation began, it spread like fire through every corner of the county. Detectives searched abandoned properties, old cabins, even storm drains that led nowhere. They found little, only traces of burned fabric, fragments of pottery, and symbols etched into rock that might have been nothing more than erosion. Yet, whispers started to circulate about a cult. The Keepers of Silence. A name that had appeared in local folklore decades earlier, always tied to disappearances and rumors of ceremonies held deep in the woods. Marcus tried not to listen, but each story carried a thread of truth that tightened around his thoughts. He was summoned to speak again with the authorities, this time in the county seat, a 2-hour drive from the park. The questioning was polite, but relentless. They wanted every detail of his discovery, every sound, every mark in the rock. They asked if he had seen other tracks, if he believed anyone else had been trapped. Marcus kept his answers careful, factual, but the detective's expression told him they were looking for something he wasn't giving them. A narrative of horror or conspiracy that could fill the gaps in their reports. He refused to speculate. Still, he left with the uneasy feeling that the case had only begun, and that it was not the law that would find its answers. That night, back at his cabin, the loneliness felt heavier than usual. He cooked a simple meal and sat by the window, watching the forest darken. The lights of the nearby highway glowed faintly through the trees like restless eyes. He thought of Joseph, now far away with his family, and wondered if the man could sleep at night. Did the earth still echo inside his dreams? Marcus knew that if he closed his own eyes, he would hear it too. The echo, the breath, the faint scratching from behind the walls of his memory. He had touched something raw, something that did not belong to the world of reason. In the following weeks, the park filled with visitors eager to see the site of the miracle. The area around the fissure had been fenced off and resealed, but people still hiked there to take pictures. They pointed to the stone, told each other exaggerated stories about spirits and divine punishment. Marcus avoided the trail whenever he could, but duty often forced him back. Every time he stood before that wall of rock, his throat tightened. He could almost feel the old presence behind it, as if the mountain remembered more than it revealed. One afternoon, a journalist approached him while he was repairing a footbridge near the trailhead. She introduced herself with the brisk confidence of someone used to getting answers. Her name was Ellen Raines, and she worked for a regional newspaper. Unlike the others, she didn't start with small talk. "Mr. Brown," she said, "I think Joseph Miller's story is just the surface of something bigger. I've been following these people, the ones he called the Keepers of Silence. I have records of similar disappearances across 3 states. Some go back 20 years. Marcus kept his eyes on his work, tightening a bolt. "You're wasting your time chasing ghosts," he said. "Maybe," Ellen replied, "but ghosts leave footprints. I think they found Joseph because he refused to join them completely. I think he was meant to stay buried." Her words made him stop. He looked at her for a long moment. There was no hysteria in her face, only quiet determination. "If that's true," he said, "then they won't like you asking questions." "I'm counting on that," she said, and left him her card. That night, Marcus dreamed of the fissure again. But this time, when he approached it, the crack had widened. A faint light shimmered inside, not cold and pale as before, but warm, flickering like the glow of candles. From within came a murmur of voices, not a single whisper, but many, rising and falling like a chant. He called out, but the stone swallowed his voice. When he woke, his hands were clenched so tightly that his palms were bleeding. Days turned into weeks. The investigation made little progress. Then, one morning, Ellen called. Her voice was strained. "I found something," she said, "an old church record from the 1970s. There was a preacher in Tennessee. Same name, same ideas. He disappeared too, and the group he led, they called themselves the Keepers of Silence. The same creed, the same symbol carved into their letters. I think the order never dissolved. It just moved." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "You should stop digging," he said. "You don't know what you're walking into." "I thought you'd understand better than anyone," she replied. "You've heard them too." Before he could answer, the line went dead. For days after that, he heard nothing. He tried calling her number, but it went straight to voicemail. He told himself she had left town, that she was chasing another lead, but the silence stretched longer than it should have. On the seventh night, he drove to her motel outside Silver Creek. Her car was still in the parking lot. The clerk at the front desk said she hadn't been seen since the morning she'd checked in. Her belongings were still in the room: laptop, notepad, even her purse. Only the recorder she always carried was missing. Marcus didn't report it immediately. He told himself there was no proof, that she might return any minute, but in his gut he knew better. He drove up to the ridge the next morning, to the sealed fissure. The caution tape fluttered in the wind. The concrete patch that covered the opening had cracked slightly at the edge, fine lines spidering outward. He knelt and touched it. The surface was cold, wet with morning dew, but beneath it, he was certain he felt a faint vibration, like a pulse too deep to belong to any machine. He stood there for a long time, until the sunlight broke fully over the valley. The wind carried the distant hum of insects and birds, but beneath it he sensed something else, an echo too regular, too alive. He backed away slowly, his chest tight. When he returned to the ranger station, he found 2 detectives waiting for him. Ellen Raines had been officially reported missing. They asked if he had spoken to her. He admitted that she had visited him, that she had mentioned the cult, but nothing more. They nodded, writing notes, their expressions unreadable. As they left, one of them said quietly, "Be careful out there, Mr. Brown. People disappear in those hills." That night, he sat outside his cabin long after dark, staring toward the outline of the mountains. The moon rose high, silvering the peaks. He could no longer tell whether the unease inside him came from fear or recognition. The silence of the park was deeper now, heavier, as though something was listening. He thought of Joseph's warning, "Don't let them come back." But what if they had never left? He remembered how years ago, as a soldier overseas, he had learned to listen for what couldn't be seen. The soft click before a detonation, the sudden pause before gunfire. The forest had that same quiet now, a silence loaded with waiting. He wondered if Joseph, wherever he was, could feel it too. Before going inside, Marcus looked one last time toward the dark horizon. The fissure was miles away, hidden beyond the trees, but he could picture it perfectly. The sealed wall, the cracks spreading slowly, the cold air whispering through. Somewhere beyond that stone, he imagined the faint outline of Ellen Raines, her voice swallowed by the same silence that had once held Joseph Miller. He closed the door behind him, locking it twice. Inside, the cabin was still and warm, yet beneath the floorboards, or perhaps only in his imagination, Marcus thought he heard a sound. 3 slow taps, then 2 quicker ones, the same rhythm he had heard on that first day when everything began. He stood motionless, listening until his pulse matched the sound. Then it stopped. Outside, the night stretched deep and endless over Silver Creek. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying with it a whisper that might have been nothing more than air, or the faint reminder that some silences were not meant to be broken. The days after Ellen's disappearance passed in a slow, choking haze. The forest around Silver Creek seemed quieter than ever before, the kind of silence that didn't soothe but pressed down on the mind, until thought itself began to echo. Marcus moved through his duties like a man walking in a dream, checking trails, logging reports, smiling briefly to tourists when necessary. But his mind stayed elsewhere, circling the same point again and again. the missing journalist, the fissure in the stone, and the faint vibration he'd felt beneath his fingertips that morning. The sound had been too rhythmic to ignore, too alive to mistake for imagination. It had pulsed like a heartbeat, deep and patient, as if the mountain itself was breathing in the memory of everything it had swallowed. At night, the dreams came back. He would see Ellen standing at the edge of the ridge, her notebook in hand, calling to him through the wind. Her voice was distant, carried and broken by the air. He would try to reach her, but the path between them always fractured, the ground collapsing into dark cracks that opened wider with every step. From below came a whispering chorus, thousands of faint voices murmuring at once, rising and falling like the tide. Each time he woke, drenched in sweat, his throat dry, the echo of that whisper still trembling in his chest. On the fifth night, unable to bear it any longer, Marcus decided to return to the fissure. He told no one where he was going, signing out his vehicle as if on a routine patrol. The air outside was heavy with the scent of pine and wet soil after rain. The moon was bright enough to light the road, turning the world into a wash of silver and black. He drove in silence, his headlights slicing through the fog that clung to the valleys. The forest seemed endless, a maze of shadows and invisible eyes. When he reached the ridge, the trailhead was deserted. The barrier that had been placed around the fissure weeks earlier was gone. The metal posts pulled from the ground, the warning signs tossed aside. His pulse quickened as he climbed the slope. The crack in the mountain loomed ahead, faintly visible even in the dark. The concrete patch that had sealed it now bore a long, jagged split across its center. A fine trickle of dust was seeping through, carried by the slow exhale of air from within. He crouched beside it, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The sound he had half dreaded, half expected came almost at once, a faint tapping from beneath the surface. 3 knocks, then silence. 2 more, softer, closer together. The same rhythm, the same impossible pattern. Marcus pressed his ear against the stone. The surface was cool and smooth, but there was movement behind it, a shifting of air, a sound that might have been breathing. His mouth went dry. He told himself it couldn't be Ellen, couldn't be anyone. The fissure had been filled. No living person could be inside. But the rhythm came again, unmistakable, deliberate. 3 slow, 2 fast. It was her. He stepped back, scanning the ground for any sign of disturbance. The soil around the crack had been disturbed recently. Boot prints, small, narrow, perhaps belonging to a woman. There were others, too, larger, deeper, overlapping each other, leading away into the woods. He followed them with the flashlight, heart pounding. They led downhill, winding between trees and across the creek, until they disappeared near a cluster of boulders that looked eerily familiar. One of them bore faint carvings, circles interwoven with lines worn nearly smooth by time. The same pattern Joseph Miller had drawn on a napkin weeks ago, trembling, whispering about the seal of silence. Marcus knelt, tracing the grooves with his fingers. The stone felt warm, as though it retained the memory of recent hands. He could almost hear the echo of movement below, a faint shifting as if the earth were hollow. His rational mind fought against it, insisting he was imagining things, that exhaustion and guilt were shaping his senses. But a deeper instinct, the same one that had drawn him to the fissure the first time, refused to let him leave. He returned to the crack at dawn. The sky was turning pale, the air sharp with the chill of morning. He set his flashlight down, gripped the edge of the damaged seal, and began prying at the concrete with his crowbar. The first strike sent a dull vibration up his arms. The second widened the split. On the third, a thin stream of cold air burst out, carrying the smell of damp stone and something faintly metallic. He hesitated, his breath clouding before him. Then came the voice. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a faint, broken sound, half breath, half word. "Marcus." He froze. The flashlight rolled away, casting the beam across the uneven ground. The voice came again, clearer now, though weak and distant. "Help me." For a moment, every rational thought deserted him. His vision narrowed until there was only the fissure and the sound from within. He slammed the crowbar into the crack again, over and over, until the cement crumbled away and chunks of rock fell loose. The opening widened by inches, enough to reveal darkness beyond. He shone the flashlight inside. Dust swirled in the beam like breath. At first, he saw nothing. Then a flicker of motion, pale fingers curling weakly against the stone. His body moved before his mind could. He dropped the crowbar and reached in, calling out, "Ellen, hold on!" The hand twitched but did not withdraw. He tried to widen the gap further, ignoring the pain in his shoulders, the scrape of rock against skin. When, at last, the fissure was open wide enough for his arm to fit, he reached in and grasped her wrist. The skin was cold, unnaturally smooth. He pulled gently, but there was resistance, as if something held her back. "Don't!" came a whisper from within, barely audible. "Not yet." He froze. The words were unmistakable, but the voice had changed. It was hers, and yet not hers, lower, rougher, layered with an echo that made it sound as though two voices were speaking together. "Ellen," he whispered, "you shouldn't have come back." The air from the fissure grew colder, the smell stronger, metallic and sweet like rust. Marcus stumbled backward, his heart hammering. He could hear movement now, something shifting inside the hollow, scraping against stone. The pale hand withdrew, vanishing into the darkness. Then silence. He stood there, shaken, unable to make sense of what he had just seen. His body screamed to run, to flee down the mountain and never return, but his feet wouldn't move. He leaned against the rock, trying to steady his breath. Somewhere, deep inside, beyond the crack, came another sound, the faint rhythm again, 3 slow, 2 fast, but now joined by others, hundreds of faint taps overlapping until the air seemed to tremble. It wasn't one person anymore, it was many. Marcus stumbled back, tripping over the scattered stones. His flashlight flickered and died, leaving him in near darkness. Only the faint light of dawn remained, silvering the edge of the fissure. The tapping stopped. For a long time there was only the wind. Then, faintly, a voice, not Ellen's, not Joseph's, but one that seemed to come from the stone itself. A whisper carried on the air. "Silence keeps what silence takes." He turned and ran, down the slope, through the forest, branches whipping against his face. The sound followed him, not as echo, but as rhythm. 3, then 2, always just behind his steps. By the time he reached his jeep, the sun was rising. He drove without looking back, his hands gripping the wheel until his knuckles went white. When he reached the ranger station, he found the door ajar. Inside, on his desk, lay a small recorder, Ellen's recorder, the one that had gone missing from her motel room. The light on it blinked red, still recording. He picked it up with trembling fingers and pressed play. At first, there was static. Then her voice, calm, deliberate, almost reverent. "Day 4. I followed the signs the preacher spoke of. They're real. The order never left. They only wait. The fissure is one of many. The sound we heard, it's not an echo. It's a call." There was a pause. Then another voice, faint and distant, Joseph's. Some doors aren't meant to open twice. The recording ended abruptly. Marcus stared at the device for a long time, then turned it off and placed it back on the desk. Outside, the forest was awake again, birds calling, the world pretending nothing had changed. But he knew better. The silence of Silver Creek was not the absence of sound. It was a living thing, patient and hungry, waiting for those who dared to listen too closely. He filed his final report that afternoon. It said nothing about Ellen, nothing about the fissure reopening, nothing about the voice that had spoken his name. The official version would be cleaner, the area sealed, the investigation ongoing, no further incidents. He locked the station door and walked out into the sunlight, leaving the keys behind. By dusk, he was gone. His Jeep was found 2 days later on a dirt road near the ridge, the driver's door open, the headlights still on. There were footprints leading toward the mountain, and then nothing. Locals still tell the story of Marcus Brown, the ranger who heard the mountain breathe. Some say he went searching for Ellen Raines and never came back. Others claim the fissure calls out on certain nights when the air is still and the moon is full. 3 knocks, then 2, echoing through the stone like a heartbeat. No one goes there anymore. The trail has overgrown and the warning signs have rusted. But sometimes when the wind shifts, those who live near Silver Creek swear they can hear a voice carried through the pines, soft, calm, and patient, whispering to the hills, "Be still. Listen. Don't leave just yet. The next story will shock you even more. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and if this one gave you chills, share it with someone who loves true mysteries. Keep watching. Your next story is just one click away."